So we're back and we're gonna do a little bit of criticism or a take on the nature of a few things with regards to CrossFit competitions: unknown and unknowable, and constantly varied. And the take is that, I won't speak for Matt. My take is that we just talked for an hour about what the sport is. And Matt, you have the NBA example that you're going to bring up, but this way of structuring competitions where the events are always changing and there's no guidelines as far as what there are parameters, but it's super wide open. And the emphasis changes from competition to competition. And what ends up happening is there's a ton of credit and emphasis that gets placed on the event organizers and on the judges. Yeah. And that is all attention that gets taken away from the athletes.
No,
that's the take.
It's a great take, but I think we maybe would want to go an inch or two further on that. We were just talking offline about the NBA playoffs, since that's happening. And the entire focus is on what the players are going to do in the game and the game itself. Like, I happen to think Boz is a good guy who's given most of his adult life to this sport, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. But why do we know who he is? Like, the casual NBA fans don't know who the head of officiating for the NBA is, who the head referee for the NFL. No one knows who these people are.
No one knows.
And those guys, it doesn't matter. Like, they're still making a living being the head of officiating. It's an important job. But like, people want to know what Patrick Mahomes is going to do, not what some official in New York, I don't know who it is, some official in New York City is going to do.
Yeah.
So the idea that there's so much emphasis given to who's designing the workouts and how are they designed misses the mark. The magic in other sports is the talent of the athletes, and in some cases the strategy of the teams and the coaches against each other or within an event. It's not about what's the test going to look like today, and I think that detracts from the athlete excellence. Now, I feel like you should always try to see things from the other side. So the other side is like, but we're finding new and novel ways to test them. All right, fine. I understand that. It's not a completely pointless argument, but there have been enough tests over time that we sort of know how to test for fitness. If they don't know after 13 years of opens, they're never going to know. So, and the other thing that's kind of a counterpoint to that is the same champions keep winning. So how are the tests really changing? Like, it's possible to make a test in which Matt Fraser didn't win the CrossFit game. Just do a ton of rowing and wall balls and running. Like, it's easy to make a test where you can pick the different winners. So the fact that so much emotional energy and time and podcast minutes are given to like what the events are doesn't happen in any other sport. And I think it's to the detriment of this, because we're talking about, like, what did Bosman and his team do? And this is not about Bosman or Dave Castro in the past. It was their job, so they did it. And they made a real sport that I competed in, and I loved it. But we're talking about, like, what's this test like? What's that test like? And it takes the focus away from the athlete's performance on the floor. It always puts a context around their performance. Like, well, Guy did really well in that because it's weightlifting. Okay. But Guy was bad at, like, let's just let the events happen. So I'm with you on that. I don't love the focus on, like, the officials and the creators. I think it's energy that's takes away from what really matters, which is the fact that these athletes are doing tasks and combinations and sequences that are not seen elsewhere. And that, like, CrossFit athletes have become real athletes in the sense of high level inspiring performances. But there's a lot of talk about, like, well, it's 20 overhead squats. Like, why are we talking about that? So I'm with you on this.
Yeah, and I think there are things that are downstream of this that are worth mentioning. So the attention, we talked about that and how it goes from the athletes to whoever the organizer is, whoever the head judge is,
Yeah.
whoever's criticizing the judges,
Right.
whatever, And yeah, as an advocate for the athletes, you want to see more attention put on the athletes. They're the ones sacrificing, they're the ones performing, they're the ones giving their lives to this, and they should be rewarded for that. And
Agreed.
we want to see the growth of the sport.
Right.
And there's something really profound about the chasing of human potential that's happening inside of CrossFit.
Absolutely.
And being the master of none and being multidisciplinary. And so there's a lot there. There's a lot there. And when you say you have to climb this rope this many times, you have to do it legless, you have to start seated. Those are all constraints. And I use this example when we were offline, but my grandparents watch American Ninja Warrior. They've never done an obstacle course in their life.
Right.
But it's self-evident.
Yep.
And so another downstream effect of constraints is you make the sport more esoteric. You make it more difficult to understand.
Yes. For
people on the outside of it. And so for all of our talk about community and the insiders and the outsiders, for the sport to grow, we need to appeal to the outsiders. And when you apply constraints to the sport, like you were saying, oh, the 3-point line has moved back, the rim is higher, and Steph Curry's shooting percentage went from 50% to 25%. It's like everyone would be furious whenever the ref blows his whistle in the last 2 minutes of a game. There's an uproar from 50% of the spectators. So
yes,
those are bad outcomes. What you want to see is Steph hit the buzzer beater, that he's practiced 100 million times. So there are all sorts of ways that, and to go back to the American Ninja Warrior example, are you wet or are you dry?
You're in the pool or you're not, right?
You're in the pool or you're not. And you made it from point A to point B, and there's no judging involved. There's no judging necessary. And so what I would like to see the sport move into. I've thought about this a lot, and what I think makes the really popular sports what they are, and makes the less popular sports less popular, are three things: as few constraints as possible, as objective as possible in outcomes, and as self-evident of a human expression as possible, meaning, great proxy for this, as little equipment needed as possible. So you look at the most popular sports: 100-meter dash, marathon, soccer, American Ninja Warrior. How much equipment is on each individual athlete? Well, almost none.
The 100-meter dash is the preeminent example of all of those things. And it's why Usain Bolt was probably the most famous athlete in the world for a while, because he had done something that every human being in human history has tried to do: run really fast. And he'd been like the peak of that. So it's like, there's no equipment. You got shoes and you got a concrete surface, buddy. And turns out both of those are optional. Actually, we could do the test without them. So, and that guy would still win. So like, I agree with you 100% that when you constrain the performance of the athletes, you put up barriers between the fans and the athletes. So if you want to, and it's barriers both in terms of like understanding how excellent they are, and it's barriers in terms of understanding the sport. Right? Like you don't need a lot of understanding of the NBA or whatever. It's like, okay, the ball go in the hoop, yes. And there's some rules about fouls, but it turns out every game you watch, they're calling more or less the same rules. There's always a little leeway for the officials, but it's the same considerations every night. So fans quickly come to understand what those considerations are. And this is like, CrossFit is like, what's going to happen today? And that leads inexorably to, what did the event organizers think of today? Which is, again, it's not about insulting the event organizers. It's insulting criticizing the presence of the event organizers.
Mhm.
Not that they're not good people. I think Boz is great. I love what he did at the games with the sandbag, very creative. But why are we doing that?
Mhm.
Why are they? Hey, it's different tests this year.
Yeah.
Does anybody think like like Michael Jordan wasn't the greatest basketball player? Well, he did the same thing every night. Well, yeah, that's the idea. That's the idea.
Yeah. So in that example, there are set constraints.
Yeah.
And then the athlete is free to express themselves
Right.
inside the constraints.
Right.
So
But they never change.
if you had the director of FIFA telling Messi how he needs to dribble, it would make no sense. You had
can pick
Adam
up the ball
Silver
and run today, Leo. Yeah.
telling Steph
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
to, if he was changing it, if he was out on the
Right.
floor, right? Boz
Right.
getting on the floor and he's like into the microphone, like, oh, we have another sandbag, it's sandbags this time, it's not
Well,
Olympic
it's
weightlifting. It's like,
seriously, there's no level of like the absurdity that we can take this to, but like Adam Silver walking out during the NBA playoffs and saying, "There's 3 basketballs tonight." Like, right? Like,
that's great. That's
there's 3
so
basketballs tonight,
fantastic imagination.
and the goals are going to be 10'7". So,
Yeah.
all right, like, and then
Yeah.
the argument back, like I said, see the other side. The argument is like, well, real fitness means you're ready for any test. And that's, you get to the core of this is like, is that a valid thing or not?
So
And
I think let's be clear on
Yeah.
like what we're criticizing and then
Yeah.
what we propose, because it's not enough to just criticize. You have to propose a better solution.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what, and I won't speak for you, but my suggestion would be to have, and IF3 has gotten at this a little bit, where they have 6 tests. Every event is 6 tests, and they have essentially a physiological dose response that they're eliciting from each test. And that might be a little too constraining for the community. So we have to be realistic in what we're suggesting, because
Absolutely.
a lot of people love that it's unknown and it's announced 3 weeks prior, or it's like at the competition and you have to react, and we've sort of found the outer limits of that. Chaos in 2019, where the athletes were doing it and they didn't even know the length of the race, which was,
that's right.
I think we all agree that was absurd. The ranch run at the Aromas Games of 2020, the Atalanta being announced right beforehand, and with the workload management not being present. So there's we could keep going on the examples of that, but so we've sort of found the outer limits of like, okay, like that kind of took it too far, but we need to have some sort of unknownness to it. And what I suggest is that you have the events don't have to be in a specific order. That's one step that IF3 took, where the first event is always an endurance event. So they specified what order the events have to come in. I think that's probably a little too constrained for CrossFit, people interested in CrossFit. But yeah, it's like we're gonna have a long aerobic event, so like this event, there's a long aerobic event, but then there's an odd object in the middle of it, so how aerobic really is it? That's an example of like, wait, so like, are we doing the aerobic thing, or we like, do we have to be aerobic? Do we have to train for that? So as a coach who prepares athletes for these competitions, it's just like, okay, well, like, how aerobic do you have to be? Like, what's the modality? Like, is it running? Like, is it swimming? Like, are we gonna paddle this year?
Right.
So is it gonna be the last event where only 10 athletes are going to be able to participate in it, or are there going to be more points up for grabs? So at stake, I should say. So we like to compare CrossFit to UFC all the time, and so a lot of people inside the space look at the success of UFC and think there's a sport that threw off constraints, right, and became more popular than boxing, more popular than wrestling, more popular than jiu-jitsu, and to great benefit of the athletes and everyone. So we look at UFC and we think, okay, like, how do we get there in 10 years? And you look at what UFC did, and they threw the constraints off of fighting. They said no gloves, right?
Whatever works.
They said octagon, right? They said any style. but no
style.
gouging, right?
Yeah, no
And
eyes, no back of the head, no
yeah,
you
exactly.
know,
So
yeah,
they actually took constraints and made them fewer. And the illusion
yeah,
of CrossFit is the same thing. It's saying any physical challenge, no constraints,
yeah,
but you have to squat this low. You have
right.
to sit before you climb the rope. You
Yeah,
have to do this many reps. Those are all constraints telling the athlete how they have to express themselves.
yeah.
So whereas, if you had obstacle course, American Ninja Warrior style, you had a marathon or like a really long aerobic event. You had
So,
a weightlifting event. And then you had some CrossFit stuff where you
but,
you had individual events that were scored with a combination of all those elements.
but
And make it as few constraints as possible, as objective as possible, and as natural of an expression as possible.
no,
Okay, I'm done now. I promise.
no, it's okay. There's a lot here, and I think I would just want to add to that. If the tests or the style of tests were known in advance, it wouldn't make the athletes less impressive. It would make them more impressive. Does anybody look at Usain Bolt and go, he's not impressive? Right? Like, it's the simplest test in human history, and he's one of the most incredible human beings that the species has ever produced. And you don't need to give him 86 tests to prove that. One is enough. I think he does the relays too, so he does 4. But you know what I'm saying? He doesn't need to be a discus thrower to, like, it doesn't matter. He's fantastic. Okay. So if the tests were known, it wouldn't make the athletes less impressive. It wouldn't. It would be like, okay, it's still awesome that you completed all these tests so well. And then you say, well, it's just like a decathlon, it's just like this. It's not, because CrossFit is its own series of tests and stressors. And the combination of movements and all that is what makes it unique, being able to do a lot of things tired, to repeatedly recruit fast twitch muscle fibers in a way that no other sport asks you to do. And to be conditioned for that is extremely, extremely hard. That's what CrossFit does. And it's beautiful in a way. But the beauty of that story is not being told, because we will devote a half-hour podcast to, are the events good or not?
Mm-hmm.
There's no NBA podcast like, is 10 feet the right height for the goal? Should the net have more hooks? You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't happen. Like, should we do away with a double dribble and allow athletes to do it once? No, it doesn't. There's some things about, like, oh, like, is the gather step a travel or not? But then everybody kind of decides that it's not, and we move on.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change the nature of the competition. So the same, we don't see that here. We see a lot of effort and energy going into, well, what are the events this year? How many times are you going to have that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's the thing. And I want to just make the point that it doesn't invalidate the fitness methodology if the events or event styles were known in advance. It doesn't invalidate it at all.
Mm-hmm. At all.
Nobody thinks like LeBron James is a crappy athlete because it's the same test every night.
Mm-hmm.
No one
Yeah.
thinks that. No one
Yeah.
thinks like the guys who play in the NFL are like, they're not impressive because it's the same thing 17 times. Like, no, it's very impressive. It's
Yeah.
very hard to do. And so is being an elite CrossFitter. Very hard to do. So
Yeah.
I'm with you. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say standardize the tests, but I looked at every CrossFit event, 425 events ever programmed by headquarters, open, regionals, games, semifinals, quarterfinals, 19 different tasks, show up 65% of the time. So it's kind of happening anyway. So just drop the pretense of like, oh, the toes to bar, they're going to be there every time. But now they're between a bike thing and sandbags. I don't know. It just seems like so much energy goes into designing the sport that doesn't need to go there anymore. And that energy should be focused into like, let's see how good these athletes are at this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's, I think, at least what I would like to see is like, the more you focus on the athletes and the less you focus on the administration of the sport, the more successful the sport will be. It's like, you have a great example in the NBA right now. John Morant has legal problems. So now everybody has a take on what's the commissioner going to do. Meanwhile, the playoffs are happening and time's not being spent on the playoffs. So this is the playoffs of CrossFit, and we're not talking about the athletes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right. So
yeah. We're not talking about the athlete. The athletes are left, to, oh, is this a good event for me? Is it,
yes.
Is this a good test for
there.
me? Like, yeah. So
This could be a 10-hour podcast, but I think we made the point of like, for me, the point is the focus on test design and constant changes around test design detracts from athlete expression and therefore harms or makes the sport less interesting.
Yeah. It appeals to novelty, and when you've been inside of it for 5 years, 10 years, yeah, you start to like get intimate with it, and
Yeah.
it's yeah.